Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny's Lady Simone. I go by Jenny, and I'm the new program manager for the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. So it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us today for our Tuesday Times Roundtable. I just want to encourage everybody to grab food, although I think most of you already did. Make sure to sign in our sign-in sheets, and also if you're part of the Global Learning Medallion group, come to see us at the end so I can sign your activity log. And also, I wanted to mention that we have a new opportunity coming up for our students, and that means that if you're interested in writing a blog post after you attend a Tuesday Times Roundtable, you can come and see me at the end, and I can give you more details. You do not have to have your own blog site. I just want the blog post that you would write, and then we'll make sure to publish it in our website and our social media. And then you'll get opportunities to get points for that. And if you're not part of the Global Learning Medallion, I just think it's really cool still to get your work out there. And then I think that's it for announcements. And so now I'm just going to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Javadzadeh. Javadzadeh. I'm really getting names right. So, has taught many subjects in criminal justice and sociology for 15 years in several different universities. His expertise is on social movements, political and sociological theories, international criminology, sociology of terrorism, and Middle East politics. He's done extensive research on Middle Eastern social and political movements and has published a book and articles about American foreign policy in the Middle East and postmodernism and terrorism as a contemporary social phenomena. He's currently the coordinator for the master's program in criminal justice at St. Thomas University. So let's give him a round. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My training is basically in sociology and criminology, and mostly sociological and criminological theory. And restorative justice, have all of you heard restorative justice before or heard of it? Or is it a new term for you? You've heard of it before? Has anyone here participated in a circle of restorative justice, or you've just heard? None of you. So restorative justice as a phenomenon is probably thousands of years old. Before we had a criminal justice system, before Cesar Beccaria and Lombroso theorized about crime and criminals and what to do with criminals and why do people commit crime, we didn't really have a system. It was not called the criminal justice system. And it wasn't mostly retributive, which is punishing the offender. And punishing the offender, depending on what kind of crime has occurred, once he or she is found guilty, then would be the main fundamental reason why we have criminal justice systems. And if you go around the world and look at different criminal justice systems, the idea is that crime is panned out quickly, swift, and it's equal. So if two different people steal cars at the same time, it's supposed to not really matter what class they're from. It's supposed to not really matter what race and ethnicity they're from. Nothing, or whether it's a man or a woman, it's not supposed to matter, and that's why it's called the criminal justice system. However, the retributive system really pays attention to, I should say, it specifically only pays attention to the offender. That is, why he or she committed the crime and what we should do with him or her. In our criminal justice system, the existing criminal justice system, the victim or victims are cast aside. Nobody really ends up caring about what happens to the victim and what will really happen to them. The only entity that cares about The victim would be the family of the victim, and nothing systematic about that. We don't have a system in place that cares about the victim. That's why it's called the criminal justice system. So it only pays attention to the criminal and the offenders, the perpetrators. Restorative justice mainly pays attention to the victim or victims and the community of the victim, and also the family of the victim, because that's the person or persons that have really been hurt. And we don't have in our criminal justice system a method where the offender gets with the victim and talks to her or him and really finds out what kind of damages have been fomented by the offender. So the offender is taken away, arrested, goes through the court system, and then if indicted and then found guilty, serving a sentence when they end up in jail or prison. And the victim, really nothing to do with the criminal justice system. They have to deal with it on their own, and there's no retribution, nothing. In the early 17th, 18th centuries, money was given by the offender to the victim, but we found out, or the state found out, it's too lucrative of a business, so the state got into it. And that's why, for example, if you make a complaint of anyone, let's say there was a domestic call, and police shows up and they take away the man who's the offender because the woman had called and has been hurt, what have you. If they take him away and they put him to jail until he's arraigned, that is, we find out whether he's guilty or not, even if the victim pulls back and says, I have no complaints anymore, the state says it doesn't matter. We still have to deal with him. That is, the state says we have also been victimized. So even though she will no longer file a complaint and she would go away and say, I have no complaints, we've been able to work things out, it doesn't matter, the state doesn't back off. So he still has to get tried. He still has to get arraigned, and he still has to get tried. So the state has stepped into, for the past 150, 160 years, into becoming part of the criminal justice system. That is, the state feels that they're victimized. Some people theorize that it's because the state found out that it's too lucrative, there's so much money involved, we don't want the victims to actually end up with the money, and the state should. Some people theorize that the reason why states feel this way, governments feel this way, is because when somebody is victimized, it's actually social injustice too. So society-wide, we should be able to have retribution and take revenge. Now, this has been going on for a long time, and if you know anything about the criminal justice system, which is made up of three pillars, which is police or law enforcement, courts, and corrections. In the American criminal justice system, and I would probably argue worldwide, probably 95% of the countries in the world that practice criminal justice system or have these systems in place are failing miserably. And by failing, I mean, I'll give you an example. In the court system in America, about 95% of people who go through the court system have to end up plea bargaining. That is, they cop a plea. 95% of the time, you don't get your constitutional rights. That is, you don't get a jury to decide on your case. I tell my students this: if you have anything, any institution, any organization, any machine, mechanical, electronic, what have you, if it fails 95% of the time, what do you do with it? You replace it, right? Or you think about doing something else with it, and it would fundamentally have to get changed. So if our court system gets people to plea bargain 95% of the time, there has to be something changed, at least from my perspective, fundamentally, because it's not working. And if you look at, for example, so that's the court. If you can't afford to get a lawyer, which is most of the time, because I don't know if you know, but the average income of an inmate today in America, inmate in jail now or prison, is below $8,000 a year, which means strictly the poor are in prison. There's a really good book written by Professor Raymond, he teaches, or he used to teach at American University in Washington, called The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison. Your chances of ending up in prison or jail heavily increases if you can't afford to get a lawyer, and heavily decreases if you have a private lawyer. It's true that in our criminal justice system, if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed to you by law, but these are public attorneys. Public attorneys handle anywhere from 60 to 80 cases a day. You get to know your attorney, if you have a public attorney, only when you're sitting in court, when they call out your name. You don't know your attorney before that. He or she doesn't know you. He or she doesn't really even know about your case. Right then and there, they ask you about you. They ask you your name. They ask what you've done. And they also tell you what kind of a plea bargaining you're having to do. All right? So if you're poor, your chances of really defending yourself, whether you committed the crime or not, really heavily decreases. But if you have a public attorney, private attorneys, if you know anyone, they have maybe 2-3 cases a day. Compare that to 60, 70, 80 cases a day for public attorneys. It's almost impossible to defend anyone if you're a public attorney. You're just going through the motions, you're telling them how to cop a plea. In the areas of arrest, that is police and law enforcement, there are heavy discrimination between whites, blacks, Hispanics, poor, rich, middle class, and so on. Depending on the car you drive, depending on the color of your skin, depending on your ethnicity, all of that heavily matters, whether you're stopped or not to begin with. In some states, the discrepancy or the disproportion of whites versus blacks being stopped by the police is 11 to 1. For 11 African Americans who were stopped, only one white person is stopped. The average nationwide is about 5 to 1, which is still 500% higher than a criminal justice system is supposed to pan out. This is the story, and you know all the horror stories by police officers and what's been going on, especially in the past few years. And the shootings of especially African-American youth by police officers, even though it's really increased in the past 2-3 years, is nothing new in the American culture. It could go back, it goes back by the criminal justice system actually to the 50s and the 60s. I personally believe, and I can show this through documents, you cannot tell the African-American story in America without the criminal justice system involved, because the criminal justice system in the U.S. has always been wrongly arresting, wrongly imprisoning, wrongly shooting African Americans for the past 300, 400 years. So since really the first ship of slaves that came over here is 1637. So, many, many years. In prison, again, if you look at the prison population, African Americans, males, are only 6% of the population of this country. They are 42% of the population in prison. Great discrepancy, right? Now, I know I'm supposed to talk about restorative justice, but we have to sort of understand the criminal justice system to also understand, and I'm sure almost none of you have been entangled with the criminal justice system. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm just speculating. I hope so. So I want to sort of give you a fundamental description of the criminal justice system to show you that it's necessary to change this or overhaul it or fundamentally do something about it. In prison, so like I said, 6% of the population are African American male, but 42% of the prison population are African American male. Put blacks and browns, that is Hispanics too, or Latinos, along with blacks, are about 31% of the population in America, male, female, black, brown. They're 77% of the prison population. So there, even in general, there's a great discrepancy. When you ask police officers, and I don't just mean regular police officers in the streets, if you ask chiefs of police, right, why is it that there are more African Americans and Latinos in prison? Their answer is because they commit more crime. And that's not true. Statistically, it's not true. I just said that whether you end up in prison or jail or not, you know the difference between jail and prison? Jail is under 365 days sentenced, and prison is over 365 days. So under 1 year, you go to jail. Over 1 year, you go to prison. So those who end up in either jail or prison are most of the people who cannot afford a public attorney, are most of the people who are wrongly stopped and wrongly arrested by police officers. So if you look at the procedure and the process from stopping to arrest to indictment to convicted to inmate, right, that process, you'll see that that process actually includes all kinds of whites and non-blacks and non-Latinos, but who actually ends up, because they cannot afford an attorney, are the ones that are poorer, the ones that are wrongly arrested, the ones that are wrongly stopped. And statistics, when you read statistics, so here's the number of people in prison and here's their race and ethnicity, only shows the consequences. It doesn't show what went on. It doesn't show that you were poor enough to not to be able to get an attorney. It doesn't show that the public attorney cannot even defend you because he or she has 80, 70 cases. Now, I've done talks in front of judges and police officers and FBI agents, people in law enforcement and criminal justice system in general, corrections officers, wardens, and so on. And when I say that the criminal justice system is miserably failing, they don't disagree with me, but they actually say there is no alternative. And that's the important point, right? I tell my criminal justice and criminology students, why are you getting a degree? Because we have plenty of detectives, we have plenty of corrections officers, we have plenty of police officers. So if you're just going to be another person that perpetuates the same system, I don't think it's a good idea for you to get a degree because you're not going to make any difference. And they often say, no, I'm going to go out there and do something and be different. I'm not going to be a cop like everybody else. I'm not going to be a detective like everybody else. I'm not going to be a lawyer and so on. I'll defend people. But these are just individuals. And I think individuals can really make a difference. This is a social problem, so it needs a social restructuring. Socio-legal restructuring. And that's why I not only talk about restorative justice, I not only do research on restorative justice, but I also do things along the sides of criminal justice system. That is, we want to, when I say we, I work with a couple of organizations that are heavily into restorative justice, and we're trying to change, starting with Miami-Dade. We've been somewhat successful. Starting with Miami-Dade to change the criminal justice system and practice restorative justice practices. So I'll explain to you what restorative justice practice is versus restorative justice in a second. So far, Dade County schools have had 53 middle schools and 49 middle schools and 4 high schools start to practice restorative justice. I don't know if you know, but there's such a phenomenon called the arrest of the youth, that is people who are going to school or high school. And we've had police officers in Dade County arresting 6, 7, 8-year-olds, arresting them, handcuffs, put in the police car and taken down to the station. This went on until 3 years ago, until we got Dade County to stop this practice. And now it's called, they're doing citations. They're called civil citations. So they can no longer arrest students in school. They have to give them up to 3 warnings. So 3 times you get a civil citation. And then the 4th time, they'll have to get the criminal justice system, that is the police, and taking down everything. But that has made a great difference. In 2015, which was the last year they were still practicing this, they arrested 37,000 students in Dade County, which is a great number. So these are like regular fights that the principal or some teacher would call the police for, and they end up arresting the students. So now what they're doing is they're practicing restorative justice. That is, they talk to those who are supposedly the offenders, the perpetrators, the ones who are responsible for starting the crime or the misdemeanor, and they get the victim or victims also involved, and they sit in circles and they talk about this. And the way they're practicing it in these schools now is the crime doesn't have to happen, or misdemeanor doesn't have to happen. There doesn't have to be a fight. There doesn't have to be an assault. What they do is they have weekly circles. And people who want to join, that is students who want to join, they can join, and they can, I'll tell you what circles are in a second. There's a diagram here. And they talk about how offenders end up hurting the victims. Victims also talk about what they really felt or how they really felt when they were victimized, which gives this justice system a human face, rather than this cold way of stopping, arresting, indicting, convicting, and imprisonment, right? Which is really, really inhumane. In Florida law, the word rehabilitation is not even mentioned once. It's all about punishment. And I don't know what your majors are, but you know punishment and severe punishment, especially the way it's taken place in our prisons, never work. Not only that, but when you serve a sentence, you come out, you can lose as many as 147 rights. And then we're punishing you, and we're expecting you to come out, we're taking away your rights, and we expect you not to go back in prison, which is called the recidivism rate. The country of New Zealand started practicing restorative justice since 1989 officially. So they're not only paying lip service to it, and they're not doing it sporadically, they're not doing it city by city. The entire country's criminal justice system is now, since 1989 actually, restorative justice. They were able to reduce recidivism that was as high as 80%. So recidivism is when you commit a crime, you go to prison, you come back, and you commit a crime, you go back, right? Going back to prison is called recidivism. And often when you hear rates of recidivism is under 5 years. So do you go back to prison under 5 years? That's recidivist. Their recidivism rate was 80%. Now it's down to 14% with restorative justice, which means they're able to rehabilitate inmates while they're in jail or prison, and they're able to educate them, train them for jobs, so that when they come out, they can actually become, I don't really like to use this phrase because it's ridiculous to say it, but law-abiding citizen. I mean, I personally think a law-abiding citizen is not a good citizen because you just become part of the herd. But nonetheless, that's a whole different story in itself. That's that's maybe sociology, not so much criminology. So this is what's happening to countries that are practicing. Canada is practicing it. England is practicing it. Like I said, New Zealand is. We have a lot of states. We have a lot of cities, like Oakland is, San Francisco is, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York. They're practicing sporadically, not systematically, restorative justice, and they're getting great results. Now, there is contention, that is a little bit of contradiction, by the extant criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system will be rendered useless if restorative justice prevails, right? So say, we don't need as many officers. I don't know if you know, but since 1992, when Clinton became president, the number of officers in America have increased tenfold, 1,000%. So we're putting more and more police officers in the streets because we think that reduces crime. And there's really no evidence of that. I personally, at FIU, saw one incident where the older gentleman with a cane who got on a shuttle bus, who was not able to afford to, I don't know, or he didn't want to pay the ticket to go to the North Campus. And he got into a sort of an altercation with the bus driver. Bus driver called FIU police, and then FIU police called Metro police. For this one older gentleman, there were 7 cops' cars around this bus. And if you looked from a distance, you'd think they just arrested Al Capone, or somebody really, really important. There was just one older gentleman who didn't want to pay $1 or $2 fee to get on the shuttle. That's not because they thought he was a threat. It's because there's just too many officers. There are too many officers in areas where they're not needed, actually. I always say a police officer is like a penny, never around when you need one. So, we have a lot of, sorry if you're police officers, I don't mean to, I don't mean you to go there fast. We do have more police officers, but not really having anything to do with imprisonment and this process of criminal justice that I'm talking about. So I really think that we need an alternative for the criminal justice system. So I'll go through this PowerPoint because there are a couple of diagrams here that I think are important that you could look at and possibly ask me questions when we're done. What's my time look like? What do I, forever? I have a, okay, so I have a class at 2 on, okay, so when we get to the questions, possibly we can decipher this even more. So restorative justice is an effort to deal with burglary and other property crime, which developed into dealing with even more violent crimes, such as death from drunken driving, assault, rape, and murder. What really happened with restorative justice, the way it started, or the reason why it started, it was pretending to sort of like, I don't want to say milder crimes, but not so heavy as murder and rape. Because they didn't think that they could have a murderer sit in a circle with the victim's family and sort of work things out. They didn't think that was possible. Now, when I gave you the example of New Zealand, they're doing murder and rape cases the same way as they're doing these other less harsher crimes. All right, so it could also be practiced with violent crimes. Recently even applied to situations of mass violence in South Africa. I don't know if you remember, there was a shooting by the police in South Africa of the miners who went on strike, and the police started shooting. They killed more than 60 miners because they wouldn't go back to work. So they started practicing restorative justice there, or using restorative justice instead of getting a whole criminal justice or political system involved. Restorative justice works to resolve conflict and repair harm. It encourages those who have caused harm to acknowledge the impact of what they have done and gives them an opportunity to make reparations. So it's mostly from the victim's perspective. It's not from the state's perspective as in relation to what they're going to do to the offender or offenders. It's what the victim feels and holds the perpetrator accountable, not by only putting them in jail, but also getting them to address whether they understand what they have done to the victim. I mean, that's really important, especially if you want this person not to commit that crime again. They have to understand the damages that they have done. It offers those who have suffered harm the opportunity to have their harm or loss acknowledged and amends made. So these are I say this is not what restorative justice is, doesn't mean it's not. So this is some of restorative justice, but it doesn't end here, is what I mean. It's not primarily about forgiveness and reconciliation, although forgiveness is a heavy part of it. You have to be able to practice that. This really helps when I have discussions with my students about capital punishment, right? Putting somebody else to death because they committed murder or capital offense, especially important. It's not primarily designed to reduce recidivism. It's not a particular program or a blueprint. It's a fundamental system. That's what it is. primarily intended for minor offenses, so it is also intended for violent offenses. Neither a panacea or necessarily a replacement for the legal system, although it should be overall in a process. And it's not necessarily the opposite of retribution. Some people may feel that still retribution is needed, despite the fact that the crime has gone through restorative justice. So this is, I don't know if you can see this, it's a little small, but it's needs of crime victims. So again, victim is pivotal here. Victim is the important part of restorative justice. Information, truth-telling, empowerment, and restitution or vindication. And what you see that yellow is really the restorative justice. And I don't know if you can see, but there are 3 components there. I can't even see. What did I do? Disappeared? Did I press something? Oh, it's back. Good. So it says family groups, peace circles, and communities. So what happens is when they get in these circles, you have the offender present, you have the victim present, you have the families of both present, if there are available, and you also have communities of both present. So it's a big circle of people, and I don't know if you know, but thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, this is how conflict was resolved, actually, within the community. And if you go to different parts of the world, especially in parts of the world where they haven't been urbanized yet, and there's small towns and villages, this is how conflict gets resolved. They actually talk to each other, and they try to resolve it that way. Especially important because the victim feels that he or she has been paid attention to, and people know how he or she feels. And also the offender knows or ends up knowing what it is they have done. I show a documentary, which is an interview with a 23-year-old who was just convicted for murder and given a 47-year sentence. So imagine a 23-year-old, right? And he was asked, what do you think about your sentence? 47 years now, so you'll be 70 when you get out. And he said, no, it's cool. I don't mind. His reason was because he said he has a sister who's addicted to crack and who's also a prostitute, and a mother who's addicted to crack. And he says that my responsibility was to take care of my mom and my sister, which isn't easy. And now he says, I'm here in prison, and I don't have to do those things anymore. All I have to do is be responsible for myself. For him, this was a good idea, right? I don't know if in our rational mind anyone would think that's a good idea, right? But imagine if there was restorative justice, right? If there was, and of course he had a record, right? He had a past with crime. And if somebody like that at that age was sort of interrupted in his life and he understood what he had done to the victims and how he's responsible for that, a person at 23 would never end up in that kind of a predicament. I mean, predicament, but really a situation, because that's like a life sentence, really. Our criminal justice system does not care about what really happens, what happened to you until you became an offender. I have a poster in my office that says, both victims and offenders are results of terrible social relations. That is, offenders aren't these people who are born with those qualities of wanting to commit crime. You become a criminal, right? And becoming a criminal, being an offender, is caused by bad social relationships. And that's what needs to get repaired, rather than let's just punish you until you sort of wake up one day and say, I've had enough punishment. Because for many people, these consequences may not even matter. Because like I said, with this one young gentleman, he didn't care that he ended up in prison for 47 years. His life, he thought, was better in prison rather than outside. So offender accountability. They have to address the resulting harms. They're encouraged to empathize and be responsible. Transform shame, encouragement and support for integration into community. Temporary restraint maybe, although not all. And encouragement to personal transformation. Opportunities for treatment, especially important, for addiction or other problems. Enhancement of personal competencies. So Portugal in 2007 made all drugs legal, or it decriminalized drugs, all drugs. So they don't treat people who use drugs as criminals. They treat them as someone who's possibly addicted. And they treat them and they treat it as an illness rather than a criminal offense. And their rates of arrest has gone to zero for crime related to drugs, because you can't commit crime if you're using drugs. And their recidivism rates is almost non-existent anymore in terms of using drugs. So it really makes a big difference as to how you're treated and what we find you to be doing. The country of Sweden in 2011 also officially claimed that they've gotten rid of prostitution. And they did that by taking prostitutes wherever they found them in Sweden and training them and educating them and then helping them to get a job so that they don't need to be prostitutes anymore. And they didn't treat them as offenders. They treated them as people who needed to, socioeconomic reasons. So they officially said, after working on this problem for 20 years, they said, we no longer have prostitutes in our streets in Sweden. And there have been reports that it's true. I don't know, this is a proclamation of the Swede government, so people have to still do some research to see whether it's true or not. So the basic thing for restorative justice is communities' need for justice, attention to the concern as victims again, opportunities to build a sense of community and mutual accountability, encouragement to take on their obligations and welfare of their members, including victim and offenders, and assurance for preventative actions. We don't, in America, really, it's the same model as the medical model. What we do is we wait until people get sick and then treat them. The same thing with criminal justice system. We wait until people commit crime and then punish them. Our medical model is the same thing. We don't try to tell people how to eat, how to be healthy, and so on. So this isn't related, but I'll just tell you, if you go on websites of American Cancer Society, American Diabetes Society, American Heart Disease Society, you'll see that on their website, on the first page, the food they encourage you to eat, actually, is the food that causes cancer, causes heart disease, causes diabetes. Because our medical model waits until we get sick and then wants to treat us, as opposed to preventative, right? Criminal justice system, the same thing. Wait until we commit crime, no matter what's happening before you commit crime, no matter what socioeconomic circumstances you're living under, no matter what's happening in your life, no matter whether you've been a child who's been abused sexually, physically, psychologically. We don't care about that. We wait until you commit crime, then we want to punish you. That's not a model that will be able to be sustainable in terms of deterring crime and decreasing crime. It's a model that will fail all the time because the fundamental needs of human beings aren't being met. I give this example. I don't know if in your mind this is related, but in Florida alone, close to 1 million children go to bed every night hungry. I'm not arguing that hunger makes you commit crime, but living in those conditions is pretty conducive to want to do something about it. So simple thing like food, right? Hunger. There are about 50, according to government numbers, and there are way more than that, I think. But you have to read other research. 15 million Americans who are hungry, right? Officially hungry. At the same time, we throw away, in America only, 1 trillion pounds of food every year. 1 trillion pounds. 1,000 billion pounds of food is thrown away every year in America while we have 15 million hungry people. So, there are great socioeconomics involved in committing crime and becoming a potential perpetrator and offender. Restorative justice, these are the 4 pillars. Crime is a violation of people and of interpersonal relationships. Violations create obligations. The central obligation is to put right the wrongs. I don't know if you see this. So it's active accountability, inclusive decision-making, repairing harm, and rebuilding trust. I was talking for a group of police officers and prosecutors, and I was talking about restorative justice, and they're sort of laughing at the idea because they thought that this would never work because it's too soft on hard criminals. My contention is, I don't know if you know, but 4% of the prison population inmates are there for murder 1, and 3% are there for rape, right? So that's 3, 4, forget some are raped and killed. So let's just say they're exclusive. So 3%, 4%, 7%. 7% for rape and murder. A very large majority, which is 77%, are there for property theft, 47% for drug charges. All of those people that are in jail, aside from rape and murder, police officers, you can laugh that we cannot restore justice by treating a murderer in a circle. Let's just say that's true. But what about the majority of the inmates? What about the majority of the crime that's being committed, right? Even if we want to start restorative justice, even if people feel that it's too humane and it's too compassionate, which is what we really need rather than systematic punishment, we can start with people whose crime are not so harsh and are not violent. But we don't even pay attention to any of this. Our prison population has increased to 2.3 million. The largest prison population in the world, per portion of the population and by number. So 1 out of every 125 American is in prison. And the entanglement, not just being in prison, but entanglement with the criminal justice system, that is those who have bracelets, ankle bracelets, those who are on probation, and so on, is 5 million, which means 1 in every 77 American is actually entangled with the criminal justice system. 1 in every 3 African American male has served a sentence or will serve a sentence. 1 out of 3 is 33% of African. So if you know 3 African American males, chances are that 1 of them has been entangled with imprisonment, the criminal justice system. And I don't think it's sustainable. I'll tell you my theory at the end, maybe if you want to hear it, but maybe not. So 3 pillars of restorative justice are harms and needs of victims, but also communities and offenders, obligations that have resulted from this harm, offenders, but also communities, engagement of those who have a legitimate interest or stake in the offense and its resolution, victims, offenders, community members. So community members, which is also just like victims, are excluded from the criminal justice system, play the biggest role in reducing crime and deterring crime and preventing crime, not just the victim and the offender. So these are the 2 basic differences between the criminal justice system and restorative justice. Criminal justice system, crime, as far as the criminal justice system is concerned, crime is a violation of the law and the state. Restorative justice argues crime is a violation of people and obligations. Criminal justice system believes that violations create guilt. Restorative justice argues that violations create obligation. So how are you obligated to your community as an offender? Justice requires the state to determine the blame, guilt, and impose pain or punishment. Justice, for restorative justice, involves victims, offenders, and community in an effort to put things right. Central focus of criminal justice system is offenders getting what they deserve. And for restorative justice, central focus is victims' needs and offender responsibility for the pairing harm. The three proposals that I usually make, or restorative justice makes, is that criminal justice questions what laws have been broken, which is always the case. And when you talk to people, well, he broke the law. And the law is not something that's supernaturally given to us. The law is man-made, so we can change them. Just like we changed laws for slavery, changed laws for women being able to vote. All those laws have been changed. And what do they deserve? Restorative justice asks, who has been hurt? Again, the victim is important. What are their needs, and whose obligations are these? Who has to restore justice? And that's that. To wrap up, I'm arguing that communities can resolve crime way better than the extant criminal justice system, that is police, courts, and corrections, because in all of those three realms, they're failing miserably. They're really failing as far as deterring crime, decreasing crime, and getting rid of violence. American culture is more and more enchanted with violence. I often ask my graduate students to write papers on why is it that we like violence so much. I've been to movies where in the first 3 minutes, 200 people don't get killed and people walk out. I've been to movies where there's dialogue and people walk out because we don't like to hear people talk. We don't like to see people think. All we like is for heads to roll. We like the violence, we like the gore, we like the blood. Even when you see a love scene or a sex scene, they go to bed or on the couch now, they kiss, and it's the next day. You skip through that, right? The sex, which is human. When it comes to violence, every gory detail of blood and intestines and heart and things that you should not see is actually on the screen, right? That doesn't get any ratings for people or children not to watch. Only the sex part gets ratings for people not to watch. I don't know if you've seen the movie Boys Don't Cry, which got an NC-17 rating, which was an X before. That movie got a rating of NC-17 not because of the violence, that somebody's head gets blown off, that there's a rape scene. It got an NC-17 rating because she was panting, heavily breathing, for longer than 5 seconds. That's why I got an NC-17 rating. So violence, we're really comfortable with. And when it comes to being violent, treating violence, and talking about violence, we can deal with that. But when it comes to human relationships and what we really do in terms of how human we can be and how we can restore justice through being human and compassion, is really nothing that we talk about. We talk about how harsh we are, how, the people coming out of their cars in traffic and shooting others. This is an American phenomenon. So we have to understand, I have my own theories, I don't want to bore you with that, but we have to understand our enchantment with violence. Our enchantment with violence has to do with people committing crime. It also has to do with how crime gets punished, or restored, or gotten rid of, or deterred, or decreased. All right, I'll stop now and then try and answer some questions if you have any questions. Yes. What happens with policing especially, so let's say in Baltimore, with restorative justice, police is pushed aside. because community and families are taking responsibility. We have right now these neighborhood watch organizations. This is the neighborhood actually taking care of their neighborhood. And that, I don't know if you know, but it increased because they felt that police is not doing anything. So they push police aside and they do it on their own. And I personally don't think using marijuana is violent. And that's why we've made, I don't know if you know, but in December 23rd, Trump signed the new justice program, which is only for federal prisoners, which is only 180,000 out of the 2.3 million. But they reduced the mandatory sentencing for drugs and for all punishments. But also they're sort of retroactively freeing or letting go inmates that were there for drug charges, some drug charges, simple drug charges. But restorative justice can restore this kind of an arrest when it takes place in minority groups or minority neighborhoods by pushing aside or pulling away law enforcement. Because if you decriminalize, then law enforcement doesn't really need to be there. And neighborhoods and communities can take care of these problems if they feel, for example, that, so we do have people who still distribute drugs, right? It's not just so much those who use it. We can decriminalize that, but what about the distribution, right? Because distribution has to also be taken into account, because if you decriminalize marijuana, then there's still other drugs, harder drugs, I guess, if you want to call them, that are being distributed. That could also be dealt with the community. And a lot of communities have actually dealt with the distributors. They've been able to push them aside because they're paying attention to whom they're victimizing, right? Which is the neighborhood, which is the community. And in cases where it's been practiced, I've seen that it's worked. And Chicago, too, is another example of it. Yes, so think about, I'll give you the example of what's happening in Dade schools. Police no longer is called to resolve the situation for 2, 3, 4, 5 students that have been, let's say, in a scuffle, fighting. What happens is they have counselors on campus that talk to people, to the students that were involved in the offense, and they put them in the circles and they resolve this. So they don't even call the police. Police has no responsibility as far as these schools are concerned. Communities can do the same thing, or have done the same thing. They don't get the police involved. They try to resolve it within the community. Again, when restorative justice is being practiced, police by law doesn't have to get involved. That's what's happening. I work with, there's a group that works with gun violence and gun violence offenders in Miami Gardens. And they're practicing restorative justice to talk to youth who are carrying guns, have been in trouble because of gun violence and so on. And none of these circles involve the police. The police has been put aside. Miami Gardens Police has at least formally accepted restorative justice as a practice. So in relation to gun violence, so they feel their obligation is not to come there and arrest you. They feel that their obligation is to actually get involved in the restorative justice circles. And they're present in some of these circles, as opposed to arresting you for what you've done. There are no arrests officially taking place. But it has to be in agreement with the police. So police can't, the police can't, if you make laws, for example, in Dade schools, if you have to give civil citations instead of arrest, that's law. If you end up arresting somebody, then you're breaking the law yourself as an officer, right? So that agreement has to pan out. And that's why municipalities, cities have to come to terms to make restorative justice a practice. Yeah, so I guess the key word for you would be police agreeing to stay away rather than by force. Right, 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 right. Yeah, and that's why the police officers and prosecutors were laughing at me. Not laughing at, but they found it funny that we can get rid of crime but through restorative justice, because they really feel that you just have to be really harsh with criminals. Community also has to agree, right? We don't want our youth, we don't want our population to end up in prison. We want to resolve it. So they also have to agree. But what happens is you need facilitators or counselors. And the 54 schools I mentioned in Miami-Dade, when they're practicing, they actually have trained counselors and they have put them, one or two, depending on how big the school is, in the school. So these are professionals who know how to run circles without the police getting involved or without higher authority getting involved. So first and foremost, it's done through counselors, it's done through professionals who know how to run these circles. And the circles are sort of sacred. So I've been trying to sort of sit in one of the circles, and they don't allow me. You have to go through a whole lot of bureaucracy to be able to, you have to get checked, they have to know who you are. You can't just go and sit in a circle. So they're very structured, I want to say. And the people that are in the circles and running them, conducting them, are professionals who know what they're doing. John Jay College is the university that started the program. They started to train counselors for restorative justice. So, it's not a bunch of us sitting together and talking. This is, really counseling. Right. New Zealand, once restorative justice has been accepted, they practice this without or not having to wait for the crime to occur. So communities conduct restorative justice without the crime occurring, which is, like I said, if they're able to tell you that how crime can hurt community, that would deter you rather than wait for you to commit crime. And then, like I said, crime occurs because of damaged relationships, and restorative justice is able to minimize that damage or get rid of that damage in general, right? So if we can talk to you about how the victims would feel if you go burglarize their home, right, or if you rob them, or if you assault them, then that would minimize. And we'll tell you, especially the offenders, if we tell you how you're damaging human beings, it's supposed to, and I say it's supposed to theoretically, but it also minimizes the offender wanting to do something like that. And that's how it's worked, in these countries and these other cities. People have been able to restore justice and tell people that you don't need to commit crime in order to gain so-and-so. And so the human relationships is what's deterring the crime. And sometimes it's true that they wait until they commit the crime and then there are circles. But the circles also, if you participate, the circles also prevent you from committing more crime. The statistics on Dade schools, whether the restorative justice has worked or not, is about to come out. I think it comes out in March. Right, so they tell us what, and I've interviewed the head of the entire restorative justice program in Dade County. She said we don't have numbers yet, but she said that it's incredible how we have minimized violence, not crime, but violence in our schools through these restorative justice acts. And if you know how I said it's hard to get into the circles? If you're a student, without having to commit crime, without having to be a victim of crime, you can participate in these circles. So it's community really coming together to understand how crime and perpetration of crime hurts the community rather than just one victim or two victims. And participation in these circles, I don't know if FIU does this, but I think they should. Restorative justice circles happen throughout the city, and I think it would be really interesting for people who are interested to participate. Not like date school, but the ones that are publicly doing it, because it's really a calming experience. It shows you what everybody believes. It trains you how to understand other human beings. I'm not trying to be. It sounds too magical, and but what I'm trying to tell you is it's worked in a lot of places. Understand the offender understanding how he or she has hurt the victim really makes a difference. Right, so they have to agree with this kind of system, and there's been many cases, especially initially when cities and countries and states started it, where the victim especially didn't want to participate. It can't go on. So there has to be agreement that both parties and their communities want to participate in it. And it initially starts with 3 people, minimally. So it's the victim, the offender, and a counselor, or 2 counselors. But it could expand if they agree. But if they don't agree, it can't work. The criminal justice system excludes victims, right? We've gotten used to being excluded. So that's where the feeling comes from, that I don't want to participate in this, because we don't understand inclusion when it comes to getting justice restored. We only understand, I want that SOB to suffer, right? That's what we understand. We don't understand that our own participation in making him understand what he has done to us also makes a difference. It makes a difference in you healing because you make him understand, but it also makes a difference for him or them to understand what they've done to you. But non-participation with victims or offender won't work. Thank you. This was fun.